I'm speaking more towards, of course, during this course, we'll more be talking about, of course, as per the title of this week, we'll be talking about blues, country, rock and roll, um, jazz, and technically rhythm and blues as well, as it is an offshoot of blues music as well. But when we talk about these music genres, we have to realize that when we talk about specific music genres, it's very confusing the terminology that we use around them because there are many subgenres. So this is why I'm going to, as I can try, as you know, if you've listened to this course, whether live or after, I can be quite scatterbrained in my teaching. But I really wanted to make sure that I chronologically, or at least thoroughly, explain the exact which genres or subgenres of which, and etc., and where these genres come from, because how a lot of these genres are adapted is that they're modifications of previous genres that they've drawn from. So when we talk about country music, for example, country music is merely, in a way, not only a regional version of blues music, but it is also an offshoot slash adaptation of blues music as well. And we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about how country music has been. Sorry for that if you're hearing something extra in the background, but we'll talk about how country music has really, especially I would say, in the 21st century, really has, at least from the eyes of the public, has not been really seen as a offshoot of blues music, but rather a cultural component, actually derivative of a culture that is not actually the originators of country music. But we'll talk about that later on. But one of the things that we really want to talk about first, and I've kind of thrown the name of the genre around just a little bit, especially when I was talking about country music, but we want to talk about blues music. And when we think about music in America, we have to realize, and whether this be food culture, and I really wanted to do a module on food culture, but we weren't really able to go through that. But when we think about America, of course, the phrase that we are constantly given is it is the melting pot per se. It is the, in some cases, some sociologists don't prefer the term melting pot for a lot of different reasons. Some people say the American salad. Well, when we think about whether it be food culture or music culture, American culture really, and if you've ever had any European friends or you've ever spoken to someone from Europe, not even just Europe, but other countries outside the United States, a lot of people think of American culture as one of the very commercialized culture of McDonald's and Burger King, etc., or it's lacking of culture. That's not exactly the case, as we've discussed this for almost the last 6 weeks. It's more of American culture is the amalgamation of, primarily, in my opinion, as we discovered, of African American or Black culture that has changed because of the cutting off of the African diaspora's connection to their previous cultures on the African continent. So when we say American culture or Black American culture, and I'm not saying Black American culture is the only thing or is the sole representative of American culture, because there are multiple different American cultures, whether it be immigrant cultures such as Italian American or Mexican American cultures, or even, per example, European American cultures such as settler British colonial cultures as well. But when I say this, what we see is there is a large, and I think we all know this as we've seen TV, we've listened to music. There is a large contribution, and almost you could say a large dominance of Black Americans when it comes to music genre. And we'll talk about the reasons for that. We kind of also talked about why this was a thing a little bit when we were talking about the Harlem Renaissance and it's kind of its connection to jazz culture as well. But what we really have to take note of, per se, is that when we see the Harlem Renaissance and when we see, a lot of these things we establish, we have to realize that these music genres are very popular from a very small section of the population. To this day, Black Americans account for nearly 13 to 14% based on, of course, the accuracy of the census is not always completely accurate, but that's around the ballpark of where Black Americans are. And if we say today where there's a population of this country that's 13 to 14%, of the country, but yet they produce some of the most popular music styles and genres of this culture. We definitely have to do some investigating into that. We have to do some historical analyses of why that exists, and what genres and what styles have been created by this group. So to really analyze, to really track the history of Black American music genres, we have to go back to what I like to call, if the tree of American music genres, or if the American music genres were a tree, the very deeply implanted root or roots of the tree will be blues music. And to describe, you might have heard blues music in multiple different contexts. You might have heard it as the blues. You might have heard it as as a part of rhythm and blues, etc., etc. But to really define it, it's harder to define music than it is to define specific historical figures or specific laws or specific events in history. But blues music is more to establish. It's basically as most music is, but really blues really harkens this. Blues is a storytelling mechanism. It's a storytelling vehicle through music, which it usually uses traditions such as um, or it typically uses. Sorry about that. It also uses other, like I said before, it also uses other instruments such as the banjo, harmonica, guitar, um, etc. Typically, and what we see is a very, like I said, it's a typically acoustic style. But later on, as the popularization of electric instruments really comes into foray when it comes to music, we also see the incorporation of electronic instruments as well. But the blues is a storytelling mechanism. And the blues really becomes popular, especially amongst Black Americans, as a way to musically, like I said, going back to that storytelling, to tell stories about not just everyday pains or just personal struggles, whether it be romantic struggles, friendship struggles, etc. But it is a way to tell stories through music, and as it's basically an oral it's an oral history tracking tradition. And the reason why I talk about this is what we see in a lot of African diasporic cultures and Black American culture, but specifically all African diasporic cultures, is that most, if not all of these cultures, practice oral histories over traditional written histories, as we see within European societies. We see that they're written. Very specific written and calculated histories are very specific and very not unique, but very much more common in European societies, whereas African, Southeast Asian, and other societies outside of Europe more appreciate oral histories, and in some cases visual histories. And what I mean by visual histories is, I forgot, but there's a West African tribe. I believe it is and now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it's very popular in many museums. But there's this thing called the Lukasa Memory Board. It's similar to what we now know as an abacus in Arabian history, but it's basically a visual vehicle for telling stories and a visual vehicle for accounting for history and telling a story and seeing where someone's culture comes from. So what the reason why the blues is one, a very popular genre that is established and created by Black people, especially formerly enslaved Black people in the United States, is that it serves as a way to tell stories about what's happening currently or the pains of the past. So blues definitely covers, of course, it definitely covers slavery, it definitely covers Jim Crow, it definitely covers sharecroppers, it covers a multitude of different struggles within the Black American history. And that tradition would continue all the way down to, which we'll talk about next week, into rap music and spoken word as another form of that storytelling vehicle or storytelling mechanism. So when we really talk about the blues, or when we talk about when we talk about these genres, we have to realize that these genres are merely at its core. Of course, there are differences in terms of the instruments and the stylings and I'm not going to go too much into it because I am more of a historian than I am a musician. Um, but these are very much musical genres that are built off of telling a story or recording history, if anything. So, like I said, the blues is the originating, it is the root of the tree, it is the seedling, even. It is the seed, even for all American music genres, and even not just American music genres. As we'll talk about, there's some offshoots of jazz and rock music, specifically ska and Jamaican tradition, that are influenced by American music genres and are influenced by blues music as we start. So, like I said, as we start to track to other genres, remember that it all comes back to blues music. And I'm not saying that blues music was the first ever genre, the foundation for American genres and how American genres are continued. And if you're more of a musician than I am, if you have knowledge of blues and some of the musical tradition of blues and blues songwriting, what you'll see really is that you'll see a how should I say, you'll really see that there is a resonance all the way down to the modern music that is coming out to blues music, and the traditions of blues music are still very much harkened back to. So now that we've really talked about blues music, I've really referenced this, what we would say, call a tree of American music genres, and even outside of America, non-American music genres. And we'll talk about. I know this is primarily technically a Black American history course, but we wouldn't be properly enriched if we were to talk about how other diasporas would very much engage to carry over African tradition in their music styles, especially in places such as Brazil, Jamaica, etc., which I've already have referenced. So when we think of the blues, the next thing that we obviously think of are its two, what I like to call its two sons or its two children or its two daughters per se. So what branches off from blues, it goes straight to two really not distinct genres exactly, but I would say a genre that very much keeps the same tone and pacing as blues, but is more regional, and a genre that takes the storytelling element of blues and is much more experimental. And I say and I say that for two different reasons. So the more I would say traditional, the more regional version of blues is country music. And I say this because yes, for the most part, of course, because the majority of Black Americans had resided or had been enslaved or had lived in the South, specifically, most of these music traditions are originating from the South. However, as we'll see later on, there are obviously regional versions of these music traditions. However, country music is more reminiscent, or what we know as country music, or and country and I want to make the declaration that country music and folk music are not the same thing. That's a common misconception, that country music and folk music are not the same thing. Folk music is a large umbrella term that describes multiple different things, and folk music, I don't want to explain that right now. Um but country music is that the more regional, more traditional, more, I guess you could say, close to interpretation of um blues music, so it's much more similar to blues music. However, the more, I guess you could say, black sheep of the family, the more rebellious stepchild, not stepchild, but rebellious child of the family per se, or the more experimental one, or the less traditional one, was jazz music. And when we think of jazz music and country music, we think of them as almost very two differently contrast, completely different genres, of course. We think of these two genres as not only musically different, but if we were to be, I guess we don't want to be stereotypical in our thinking, but a lot of us think that there's two different, um, two different audiences for jazz music. Jazz music, at least today, is thought of as a very sophisticated, um, very formal genre, at least today. And country music is thought of as a very is thought of as of having a Viewership, I guess is not the right term, but audience that is typically a specific, um, from a very specific, um, from a very specific area, more specifically the South, or has specific jobs such as farmers, etc. So even though are these two genres are thought of as very completely different or very opposite genres. These two genres are essentially the two heirs of what we know as blues music. And blues music obviously continues to be its own genre. However, like I said, blues music is very much the root and foundation of all musical genres. So I want to discuss more on jazz music because we kind of discussed it last week. However, there's more of an element that we need to talk about country music, which I hinted to before. When it comes to jazz music, like I said, jazz music is and like it carries the same storytelling ability and storytelling mechanism and themes that blues music does. It carries a very similar vocal traditions, and in some cases, jazz music can be strictly instrumental. However, what jazz music does, as I've kind of put out before, is much more experimental. Jazz music is much less, and blues music was never very much rigid in tradition, but it goes away from the tradition of blues music, and it's much more distinctive. I guess you could say it's much less similar from blues music, and that's why there is that, I guess you could say, difference that we perceive between uh, jazz and country. Now, country music, and the reason why I want to save this one for last, I guess you could say, is that country music is very, very the perceptions of country music have changed. And I very much say that there are really three waves of country music that we really establish it with. And we'll talk about how other ethnicities and other cultures get involved in Black American music traditions, because when we talk about country music and we talk about rock and roll or rock music, to most eyes, these two genres are seen as primarily white genres. And as some of us may or may not know, that's not the case originally. These are genres that were created and established by Black communities and were continued by Black communities, and to this day very much still are. However, the perception of who is doing most of the music making or who are the heralds of these genres per se has definitely changed. But country music, to describe the evolution of country music over time, we could really describe it in three ways. And this is very much very basic, but when it comes to country music, there's the first wave, which I say is the inception phase or the inception wave of when country music was first started. Of course, this is a genre that was started very much as an adaptation, as a regional adaptation of blues music. It's very similar in which it's storytelling from Black Americans, specifically not only just with guitar, harmonica, etc., but also the use of the banjo, which the banjo is an instrument that has historical roots, and musical roots in Western Africa, which coincidentally, not really coincidentally, but as we could see, the descendants of West Africans who were taken to the country, who are now what we would call Black Americans or African Americans or Black people in America, would then use it as a musical tradition within country music. Um, so country music really like I said, it's more similar to blues. It still uses that storytelling mechanism. It uses very similar instruments. As I said before, jazz music is really differentiated because there's the use of more horns in the music. Of course, you hear trumpets, trombones. Also, you hear more woodwind instruments, whether it be flutes, clarinets, saxophones, etc. And um, what you're also hearing from country music, like I said, it's more similar, at least the instruments that are being used, it's more similar to blues music. It's much more simplified. Typically, it's not jazz music we associate with either big bands or large bands or jazz bands. That's not very much the case when it comes to blues or country. Of course, there are cases in which big bands or larger bands appear in both genres. However, the case is it's usually smaller individuals, and it's more, and in many cases, it's usually just one person in a way telling a story through their music or lyrics. But country music very much is, like I said, a regional version of blues music in some fashion. And what I mean by regional is when we think of country music, like I said before, when we think of country music, we think of Tennessee. Of course, when we think of Memphis, Tennessee, we also think of multiple states within the South. We also think Texas, and to some extent, we think Florida when it comes to country music. And like I said before, all it is blues. It's more widespread. Without the country blues, it's more representative of the entire country, whereas country music is just blues that is more representative of the South and Texas and Florida as opposed to the entire country. Um, and going back to the wave system, we've kind of declared here in this situation. So when it comes to the first wave, it's the inception wave, and then the second wave is it's what I call the outlaw wave per se. So this is the beginning of the involvement of typically white American individuals from the South, but also California and Texas in country music. So this is when you have your Waylon Jennings, you have your Johnny Cash's, you have even per se your Dolly Partons and Reba McEntire starting to get involved. So this is really the early, I would say, the 1940s all the way up to 1990. And what we see is after, and this is specifically after 2001 because of historical events, even we could even declare basically just rise in patriotism because of, unfortunately, the 9/11 attacks. Country music very much changes from to be quite honest, country music was not a very, what we would say, a very patriotic genre. It was a genre that was more of a to describe the stories of the Old West, or to describe the stories of segregation, or to describe the stories of Black history. But when it was, sung through the lens of white Americans, it was also to talk about outlaws and to talk about not really patriotism or pride in one's nation, but also kind of almost the opposite of that in some cases. So what we saw was the Johnny Cash's, the outlaws dressed in black who represented, white American country styles or white American country traditions, whether it be lyrically or musically, kind of faded away and were replaced specifically after 2001 by a much more, what we would say, patriotic or nationalistic country music. And so the third wave of country music after 2001 specifically is what we now know as modern country music, which is country music. This era of country music is not only defined by this increased sense of nationalism or patriotism, but it's also denoted or I guess you could say identified by the inclusion or the mixing of other genres, specifically pop music and rap music when it comes to country music. And of course, country music has always been mixed with other genres. Like as I've declared before, country music is just a regional version of blues music. But what we see is a more specific I guess, ushering in of two subgenres of country pop and country rap music and other subgenres. But now that we have, I guess we could call the two suns laid out, we also have to talk about, of course, and it's not really listed here, but we have to talk about um, blues music. Yes, is the foundation. However, there is and I want to, and it makes very much sense. I guess it's a pun, but there's also alongside blues music, there is this ever present, what we would call godmother or godfather, or godparent of gospel music as well. And gospel music obviously changes over time, and I don't like um, using the term gospel music specifically because gospel music means a lot of different things to a lot of different people depending on what era they grew up with gospel music. Because if you were to ask someone who grew up with gospel music in the 1920s and someone who grew up with Kirk Franklin in the 90s and 2000s, they have two very different definitions of gospel music. So gospel music heavily evolves as time goes on. However, gospel music, as well as just the musical traditions of the Black church in America, really set the foundation specifically for one specific genre, and the genre that we are all, I guess, the United States becomes very enthralled with in the 1950s all the way up to really the 90s. And this genre, of course, as you may have not or may have predicted, is what we would call rock and roll, or which would be later shortened to rock music, which, as we'll talk about, there is actually a genre and historical difference between rock and roll and rock music. So, gospel music really sets the tone for rock music for a couple different reasons. From the use of specific instrumentals, it really sets the tone as one of the first genres to really use to electrify music, as in it's not acoustic. There is use of electrical music, especially the electric guitar. Specifically, when it comes to guitarists, a lot of the guitarists that we acknowledge within the quote unquote rock pantheon per se, especially in the 80s. But a lot of those famous guitarists and rock bands that came from England or also came from the United States are all really inspired by a lot of gospel musicians, specifically in the Black American church. And of course, whenever we talk about gospel musicians and we talk about electric guitars, or we just talk about guitars in general, and we also talk about, when we talk about rock and roll, we are going to inevitably come by, no matter what your opinions on him are, we're inevitably going to have to talk about Elvis Presley, of course. But when it comes to rock music and when it comes to, how gospel music has essentially inspired, alongside blues music, has inspired almost every single genre within American music, we have to think of course, we have to think of Sister Rosetta Thorpe. And Sister Rosetta Thorpe was not only, of course, heavily involved in her church as someone who was a guitarist, but she set the foundation not only as a gospel musician, but also as a guitarist, as someone who set the foundation for blues and rock music as well. And like I said, how country music is just, in a sense, blues music with a different hat on. Rock music is essentially just blues music, but someone decided to plug blues music into an outlet, essentially. And that's what rock music is. It's in a way, of course, there is an electrified music has been mentioned and has been brought to blues music, but rock music is very much, especially rock and roll, is a plugged in version of blues music. And the work of Sister Rosetta Thorpe and the work, especially of early rock and roll pioneers such as Little Richard and Chuck Berry, really show that the rock music is very much coming from the traditions of not only blues but also gospel music and gospel music traditions coming out of the Black American church. And I say this because when we talk, and like I said, I already kind of gave us I guess you could say, a premonition, not a premonition exactly, I'm using that word incorrectly, but I gave us a warning about how we are, obviously, when we discuss rock and roll music, we have to discuss Elvis Presley, of course. And we're not going to go into that exactly because I want to make sure that I create a clear definition or clear distinction between the terms of rock and roll and rock music that I've been using. When I guess in my interpretation, but also just the interpretation of many, rock and roll music is more relating to or describing earlier forms of what we know as rock music. So these are your Chuck Berrys, these are your, I guess you could say technically, or your Elvis Presleys, your Little Richards, etc. Rock music is a umbrella term for all the genres that come after rock and roll. So rock music describes not only rock and roll, but it describes the subgenres of alternative rock, hard rock, metal, technically, and we'll talk about those genres also being inspired by Black American music, and even back to gospel music. Technically, the grunge movement that happened in the 90s, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, and even all the way to, like I said before, Jamaican musical traditions such as ska as well. So when we talk about, excuse me for a second, when we talk about how should I say exactly? When we talk about these traditions that are um, heavily constant in music, we want to make sure that we are Elvis Presley, as we know, and as many have already talked about, Elvis Presley was heavily inspired by um, excuse me, I'm going to. Sorry for that. So Elvis Presley was heavily, and this is why I specifically mentioned Sister Rosetta Thorpe, was that he was heavily inspired by gospel music traditions. As someone who was living in the South and someone who was living in proximity to Black Americans in the South, as someone who was living in proximity to these gospel music traditions, and even in many cases drew heavily, and in cases was not very, I guess, moral about his drawing from of other music styles and genres. So when it comes to Elvis, the reason why I mentioned Sister Rosetta Thorpe is that Hound Dog was not a song originally written nor performed by him. It was a song that was originally performed and written by Sister Rosetta Thorpe. So when we think of rock and roll music, a lot of people think Elvis. A lot of people think Jerry Lee Lewis. A lot of people think, a lot along those lines of white artists. But we have to give credit to not only those such as Sister Rosetta Thorpe, but we also have to give credit to those who are a bit more recognized, such as Chuck Berry and Little Richard. And the reason why specifically that I mentioned Little Richard is that Little Richard eventually, as an artist and a producer and as a booker and as many he wore many hats in the musical field, excuse me, would lead to the popularization and the emergence of artists such as the Beatles, the Who, pretty much the entire British invasion, as well as more contemporary artists in the 80s such as Rick James and Prince. And what we really see is that there is when it comes to rock music, there very much is, in a way, a segregation of music eventually that comes by as soon as European artists or white American artists start to adapt these styles, start to adapt not only the style of blues and country music, and in some cases jazz music to this day, but specifically rock and roll. When Elvis gets involved in rock and roll, and when what I like to call the white emergence of rock and roll happens, there is this segregation, or there is this, I guess, unspoken word that is said when it comes to those genres, that this is now a specifically white genre politically. And a lot of, and this is just my opinion specifically, but a lot of genres or a lot of artists get renamed as, or get put into different genres, specifically because there are certain genres that are looked at as white only genres. Like, especially in the 70s and 60s, the only reason, in my opinion, which funk music really becomes a named genre is because funk music is essentially the same traditions and the same, it's not the same sound, but a very similar sound to rock music. However, because rock music was at that time in the 50s, starting in the 50s, but really established in the 70s as a white genre, then funk music was basically a way to title basically black people doing rock music, essentially. Um, so what we really want to see or say in this case is that in its own way, music genres become segregated within themselves, and they become the naming of music genres themselves are heavily attached to race, and that's why I want to be very careful about the definitions that I'm using. But when it comes to rock music, it's very useful that we get into the subgenres of rock music, and we get into how these genres really popped up and how these genres start to exist, really. So one of the things that we obviously need to talk about is not just rock and roll music, but we need to talk about, like I said, the subgenres. So when we think of rock and roll, it is the period of the 50s to the 60s specifically, of the early stages of rock music. It is a very, this is the use of electric guitars. It's not really as experimental. And it sets the groundwork for other subgenres of rock music, but also sets the groundwork for pop music, which eventually becomes its own genre. Um, but when it comes to rock music, what we really see is, like I said, it's that segregation of the genre within itself. And because of that, we also see different subgenres pop up. So when we think of rock music, the main subgenres that we think of, and I kind of listed them out before, is we of course think of traditional rock music. We think of what is called as classic rock, which is kind of the what we know as the I guess you could say the pantheon of rock, and plus the British invasion. So you have your Beatles, which are within classic rock. You have your Led Zeppelin, you have your Queen, etc. And then you also have metal, which really starts to form around the 70s and 80s. And which is a style of harder rock, which is much more emotionally heavy in a way, musically. And then you also have punk music, which also established itself in the 70s. These are all, even still, like I said before, even though rock was being seen as a white only genre, these are all music genres that were started by, heavily influenced by, or in many cases created by Black individuals. And I wanted to make that very clear because historically, for those who typically are not historically inclined, there's this case, or there's this whole situation, or there's this perception that Elvis Presley decided to create rock music single-handedly in Graceland, Tennessee. And that definitely is not the case, as we know. Um, Elvis Presley has made his own contributions to rock music, but those contributions obviously would not be possible without those who came before him and those he drew from, which I said before, which were not only Black people but the Black church as well. Um, so to really talk about these subgenres that I'm speaking of, I really want to start first on. We already went over classic rock, and there's not really much to speak on when it comes to that. But I really wanted to talk about the traditions of funk music specifically. And we talked a little about how funk music was essentially, like I said, it's not country music where country music is just blues with a different hat on. Funk music was a way to describe rock music specifically done by a specific group of people, specifically African Americans. And funk music really changes, and the reason why I talk about it is because it's kind of its own foundation for a lot of different music after it, but it really changes over time because not only is it, essentially a genre that was only really differentiated because of race, but it was also became its own thing because of, sorry for that. It also became its own thing because of some other musical traditions that were being added into it. Funk really establishes not only the groundwork for rap music, but also the disco, specifically disco in the 70s, and from the 70s to the very early 80s. As we know, disco died out very quickly relatively to other genres. Electronic music, modern pop music as well. But at the same time, when it comes to other genres that are described as what we would say, it's still that rock genre, or it's still the genre, but it's just named something differently because the people who took part of it, you can very much say the same thing in a way for pop music in a way. And the reason why I say this for pop and rock music is like, if we were to say that funk is the word for Black people doing rock music, I would say, in my opinion, R&B and Motown is the word for Black people doing pop music, essentially, especially in the early 50s and 60s. Because pop music, even though we would say, at least historically, we would define pop music as something exclusive to we would define it as something exclusive to the post 80s or after Michael Jackson and Madonna. It really is turned or coined, or at least historically coined, during the British invasion, specifically with the Beatles. The Beatles were not only described as a rock band, but it was also a popular music or pop music movement. And what we see is, I said this, I guess, misconfiguration not the Beatles. It is not what a lot of people attribute pop music to when it comes to the Velvet Underground, or it's not other British invasion bands. It is the it is really the Motown music movement, or the Motown genre, that really sets the standard for pop music. Music not only is just the genres that we see, but specifically in America, is a business of music. It is the production of specific musical figures. It is the, I guess you would say in a way, grooming of stars to become not only musically viable and musically popular, but also financially viable as well. So what we see is the system of contracting, the systems of advertising, those systems of promoting and things like that that we see today for all genres really starts with Motown. And specifically Motown Records, the popularization and the signing of acts such as Diana Ross and the Supremes, Aretha Franklin, even individuals in the earlier 50s, such as Sam Cooke, really are a Sam Cooke, not just Sam Cooke as well. I'm sorry, I'm blanking slightly. Ray Charles, even Chuck Berry, Little Richard, those individuals, whether they be a part of that Motown movement or a part of Motown Records or not, really established not only pop music as a genre, but as a business, essentially. It really starts establishing the superstar system of singles and things like this. So the whole, someone going solo is not originating from a pop music band in the 90s. It's originating from Diana Ross and the Supremes after she goes solo and leaves the Supremes. So what we're really saying when it comes to music traditions and when it comes to music genres is that a lot of these music genres really, and a lot of not just the musical traditions of a lot of these music genres, but a lot of the, how should we say, a lot of the business traditions of these music genres also derive from a lot of traditions that we see within, whether church or whether it be Motown Records as well. But what we really have to think of when it comes to these genres specifically is that we have to, sorry, I'm trying to find words for this. We have to be observant of how impactful the financial side of the music industry is in determining who are the quote unquote originators of music, etc. Affected by just who makes music or who makes music or who made music first. It is heavily impacted by, especially in modern music tradition, especially in the 1900s, especially after 1950, especially when it becomes more commercialized, industrialized, it really becomes those who write music history are the producers and the studio executives, essentially. And what we see really is that a lot of these individuals who are writing music history are rewriting it in a way, and this is why this module is so important, are rewriting it in a manner in which we're saying those who are originating music genres such as blues, country, etc., which come from Black Americans or which come from the Black church, not being credited. Like I said, the industrialization or the commercialization of the music industry is exactly why we have this perception, or some have the perception, that Elvis Presley created rock and roll music, which we know is not correct or is not the case exactly. So the reason why is because, and we discussed this last music, when it comes to jazz music, there was a discomfort within the country, especially from the 20s to the 50s, in which, despite Jim Crow happening, and despite incredible segregation, incredible discrimination, and incredible racism in the country happening from the 1920s and 50s, you would still see a Black person on TV, or a Black person in a jazz club performing, or a Black person on a record, even though you could not see them or see them when you listen to the record. You see them on the face of the record or the cover of the record, and there was this large uncomfortability with how is a group that is being discriminated against, or we are discriminating against, dominating these musical traditions. And that's the issue that really faces popular music at the time, and really faces music when it becomes industrialized. Because the issue is, if music is supposed to be industrialized to a certain fashion per se, or is supposed to be, is being curated to become popular, if you want a music record to sell, or you want something to become very popular, it's not just the musician's ability. Of course, the musician's ability really counts for that, but also, as we say, America is a nation of advertising. It's a nation of advertisement, and if you want to sell something, you have to sell something that was popular. And obviously, in an era from the 20s to the 50s, that was an era of not only this lack of acceptance of Black people, but also this, in many cases, discrimination. There was not going to be an acceptance of Black artists, no matter how talented they were, no matter how talented jazz music may be, no matter how talented blues or country music would be. It was always preferred that you had a Black genre, but you had a white face. The music was acceptable, but it was not acceptable if the person who was playing the music was someone who was not a face that was preferred in the country. So what I really say is, a lot of these genres, whether it be the naming of genres specifically, or it be many other things, happen specifically because, in my opinion, and then if anything, these genres are much more tolerable, or music is much more tolerable when it is a familiar face, or when it is a face that is accepted within the country. And that's why we have the stories of, well, Elvis Presley is the pioneer of rock music, or the sole pioneer of rock music, or the Beatles or the sole pioneer of pop music. That's why we have those stories, because it is much more acceptable, and it was much more acceptable and much more tolerable to have those stories, or to have those people be the face of music, rather than a people or a group of people who were not accepted at the time. And what we really see is music, people music not only becomes a vehicle in a lot of ways for, in many cases, for many Black Americans to be discriminated against, but it also becomes a vehicle in many cases and in many ways. And this is why I specifically mentioned Aretha Franklin, for social change, specifically when it comes to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. Aretha Franklin's respect was not only heavily reminiscent with the values and what the values of the Civil Rights Movement, but it was also heavily reminiscent from many Black artists and many Black musicians, saying that they should be recognized for their accomplishments in the genre or in music as a whole, because a lot of them were appreciated for their music, but they were not appreciated for their appearance. And that's something that we really saw, and that's why it's our responsibility in a way to talk about these genres and really dig into who started these genres, because a lot of people were not given the credit that they were given. Of course, more credit and more, I don't know, discovery is the right word to use here, but more responsibility has been put on people who are studying music as a whole. So that's what we've really seen with it in general. But when it really comes to these music genres, it's very much that we need to discover, and we need to talk about how music genres have been really discovered, or have really been created. Because if you don't talk about that, then the notion goes out that there was no cultural contributions by Black Americans in the country, which, as we know, and which, as we have discussed, is very much not the truth. And one of the things that I want to talk about is that when it comes to Black history and music, especially in the 50s and 60s, well, not just the 50s and 60s, but going back to the 20s, specifically with jazz, going back to jazz as a musical tradition, as a music genre, jazz was extremely impactful um, with a very specific music genre that becomes very popular in another country, specifically Jamaica. And the reason why I mentioned Jamaica, and I kind of mentioned Jamaica and ska music, and I'll describe what ska music is. But Jamaica was heavily inspired by the sounds of 1920s black jazz music performers. Of course, not only as jazz being a very popular genre, but Jamaica also being a majority, also being a country with a large black population as well. So what we now know as reggae music, or the music of Bob Marley, or what we know as the music of Jamaica, which I would say one of the largest, if not most famous imports of Jamaica, has to be its music, that was heavily inspired by the creations of, or just the musical stylings or music traditions of Black people creating jazz music um, in the United States. The beginnings of reggae music are actually not reggae specifically. Reggae was not the first musical tradition um, in Jamaica. The first musical tradition was actually indigenous music, but I won't talk about that. But the prototype, I guess you would say, of reggae music was actually a much more fast paced, very much more similar to jazz music version called ska music. And ska music eventually turns into its own thing, specifically in the 1990s and 1970s, really in the United Kingdom and California. But ska music starts in the 1950s and 60s in in Jamaica as its first wave of ska music. And like I said before, it's a replication of American jazz tradition spanning from the 1920s to the 1950s and 60s. And ska music, like I said before, is not only a replication or an attempted replication of these music styles, but it is also a combination of Jamaican musical tradition with Black American musical tradition. And what we see is it creates this genre, like I said before, called ska music. And then eventually, ska music, still stays as its own genre, but ska music starts or stays as the inspiration for what we now know as reggae music as well. And what we see is not only are the genres that we know today, whether it be country music or be regional variants, but they're also, in many cases, the combination of different musical genres created by by Black people in America. So, what we would, I guess, a good example um, of how many genres are just hodgepodges of each other, especially from Black American musical tradition, is grunge music per se. Grunge music was a musical movement that really was very popular in the Pacific Northwest, and a lot of people kind of joke of it as this kind of it's representative of the weather of Seattle. Grunge music was a subgenre of rock music, which was very emotionally heavy. It was very emotionally reminiscent of, I guess you could say, um, the weather, the constantly rainy weather of Seattle and the entirety of the Pacific Northwest. And what it was not just this, random group of people in the 90s really starting to really want to sing about how rainy and how cold it is in the Pacific Northwest, but it was a combination of the blues going back all the way back to the 1920s and specifically hard rock or heavy rock music that was created or was really inspired heavily by the musings of the Black church or Black gospel music, or even going all the way back to Sister Rosetta Thorpe. So almost every single genre, whether it be something even as modern or as, I guess you could say, completely different from the storytelling of the blues, was, is, and continues to be inspired by Black American music genres. We won't really get into electronic music because I want to save that for next week because that's its whole thing. And as I described before, that's more of an offshoot of disco and more of an offshoot of other music genres. But like I said, if you were to give, of course, this is not the case for every single genre, but you can nearly connect almost most, if not all, American music genres, and even some non-American music genres, all the way to blues music and all the way back to gospel music coming out of the Black church. It is very easy to do so if you see and realize that at the heart of these genres, at the heart of these foundation genres, is the same storytelling mechanism or the same storytelling vehicle that was constantly being used as I guess you would say the primary focus of these first genres. Um, and what we really see is that, how should I say exactly? Um, what we really see is that not only do we have the proliferation or the foundation of, blues and gospel being a thing, but also, like I said before, from it descends country music and jazz music, and from everything else descends multiple different genres and multiple different subgenres as well. Um, but what I really wanted to kind of harken back on is I really said a lot about the impact that not only just making music does, but the impact of the commercialization of the music industry and how that actually changes how we perceive and how we teach history around music, and how that gives us, exactly like I said, the perceptions that, certain people are, were the creators of certain genres, in which that may not actually be the case. Um, so I think what we really have to take note of, per se, is how are genres created, or how are music genres created in the first place, and how, when we say, I guess we say the phrase that Black people created rock and roll, or Elvis Presley created rock and roll, or whoever created rock and roll, per se, how does someone even create a genre of music? How does that happen? How do you historically write that down? How does that even be historically recorded? When we say someone creates a music genre, what we're really saying is, and this is why when someone comes to you and says, well, this person created rock and roll, there's no such thing as one person creating a music genre. A music genre is a creation of a community. It's a not only the creation of a community of musicians, but is the creation of a community of people and their stories and their struggles. And that's why we say that Black people have created these genres, because not just rock and roll and all of these other things, but the blues is not only has been created, or all these music genres were created by a community of people, specifically, or in many cases, a church, a religious tradition. It was created by specific stories and specific experiences exclusive to or very common within that community of people. And then it was also a, you know, other musical traditions common with that community of people when it comes to country music. Of course, the banjo was not common to European immigrants or European or white settlers in America. That was not common. That was not existent. It was really only common or knowledgeable amongst those of West African descent, which happened to be what we now know as a Black American diaspora in the country. So, what we really have to take note of is that there's no real way to track down the exact individual. Like, yes, I very much commended, and I will continue to commend Sister Rosetta Thorpe as a pioneer of rock and roll music, as who she is. However, there is no specific person who created rock and roll, and there will be no specific person who creates a specific music genre. Even if there is one person who's specifically responsible, they were influenced by multiple other people they were in community with, who they possibly went to church with, who they were related to, etc., etc. So when we talk about, and when we, just to kind of wrap this up a bit, when we talk about these different communities, when we talk about these different genres per se, a lot of these genres are not only reminiscent of the communities that they're established in, but they're also reminiscent of the time that they're taking place in. I discussed last week that jazz, specifically jazz in the 1920s, was very much a product of its time, as it was a product of specifically the Harlem Renaissance and the emergence of Black artists during the time. But what we really see, like I said, blues is very similar, where it's a product of not only those who were formerly enslaved or currently being enslaved, but it was also a product of the immense political and racial turmoil that was happening at that time. And it was a product of the historical events of the time. Um, and what we really have to realize is that music, the reason why music history is important is music history is not for just entertainment. Music history is very much a tracking of the actual history. And I won't want to use the word actual history because music history is also actual history, but it's a tracking of other forms or the studying of history that is happening at that time. So, what we really but it gives us what was happening. Like I said, when it comes to blues music, like I said, it was a tracking of or contracted on. I said before, it is a regional version of blues music. So what we're seeing is blues music is the struggles of all, specifically Black people at the time, of around the country, around the United States, whereas country music is more of the expression of those who are living in specific parts of the country or parts that are constantly associated with country music. Um, and I think what we really have to be aware of is that there is, you know, there is no real way of, like I said before, saying who creates the specific person who creates a genre, but we can definitely acknowledge a specific community or a specific, whether it be racial community, ethnic community, or even religious community that starts a specific genre. That's something we can definitely acknowledge and something that we can definitely track. Um, but like I said, when it comes to music, we have to be very, like I said, we have to be as, even though some people don't see it as worth it, we have to be as focused when studying music history because music history is just the studying of history, but from a lens of who's making music during this time in history. Because every single, and we'll talk about it, but most music, as I've kind of discussed, most music is informed by or is created because as a response to what's happening in a specific area at a specific time. Um, but I just really would say, and to kind of close out here, is that we have to be, how should I say exactly? We have to, like I said, we have to acknowledge who creates these genres. We have to give proper credit, but also we have to continue to do the studying because, like I said before, the creation of rock and roll music, and even when we think of the subgenres of rock music, when we think of how gospel music inspires rock music, you would never think that gospel music, inspires metal music and gospel music. So, Sister Rosetta Thorpe technically inspires people like Ozzy Osbourne, as completely opposite as they are, but technically that is the truth. And the musical stylings are, we must give credit to these people because we have to give proper historical attribution to these people's contributions to society because there is a constant, I guess you could say, I think we might have heard this in life, or we may have not heard this in life, but there's this constant narrative being put out that there have been no cultural contributions to this country by Black people, which obviously, as we know, is not the case. And if some of us believe that is the case, I'm telling you that is definitely not the case, as we know, obviously. And what music history tells us is that not only have Black Americans contributed to this country from a, well, I guess, traditionally historical way, whether it be, serving in the army in the Civil War or being a part of movements such as the Civil Rights Movement, but we also have contributed to this country on the cultural side, whether it be art and writing, as I established last week with the Harlem Renaissance and slave narratives, but also as I established and talked about when it came to, as we established and talked about when it comes to music as well. So I really would challenge you outside of this as I close. The music that you listen to, no matter what era it's from, or whether it be blues, what genre it is, try to find a way in which you can to the best of your ability, track it back to another genre and see how far back you can track it to blues music or even country music or even in cases gospel music because the similarities are there and they are much more apparent than you think they are if you actually listen to them in a way. So as I kind of end, like I said before, I would very much say just really know that music genres, no matter how separated they may sound, are actually very similar and are all originating from the very deep roots of blues and gospel music. Before I part, do you guys have any questions before or comments before we part here? All right. Well, then we will end here today, and then next week we will talk about the traditions later on from I would really say the 60s all the way up to now when it comes to specifically disco, hip hop, rap, funk, and other genres within that span and scope, which like I said, all relate back to blues and gospel music in some format. Thank you so much. Bye bye.